It's now my pleasure to introduce Jerry-Ellig, who is a native Ohioan. Did I say that right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I was really worried about that. He's a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He's been there since 1996. He has held positions with the Federal Trade Commission and the Joint Economic Committee of Congress, and is an assistant professor of economics at George Mason University. Jerry's topic today is entitled "The Economic Case for Regulatory Reform." Please join me in welcoming Jerry-Ellig to the podium.
Okay, well, thanks, Brian. By the way, I want to compliment you on how you put together this program here today, because nobody likes to be the speaker right before lunch when people are getting hungry. So I'm glad that they gave everybody the food first, and so now everybody can just kind of munch and talk, and nobody else can get a word in edgewise because y'all are busy eating. But yeah, as Brian mentioned, I grew up in Ohio. I'm from Cincinnati originally, and a couple of years ago hit this low point in my life where I realized I'd actually spent a larger number of years of my life in Northern Virginia than in Ohio. So it's nice to be able to come back at least for a day and try to kind of get that back in balance a little bit. Just out of curiosity, any St. X high school grads in the audience? No, I'm surprised. We're not that far away from Cincinnati. Okay, anyway. Well, wanted to talk a little bit about using economic thinking and economics to work through ideas on telecom reform. It had to happen, didn't it? You come to a conference on telecommunications reform, and since telecommunications regulation is economic regulation, eventually you're going to have to hear something from an economist. But I'll try to be short anyway, and hopefully it makes sense that since we're talking about economic regulation, economic principles and research, have some useful things to say about what's going on. First question, though, may be a little bit different from what you would expect to hear an economist say about this. If we're talking about somehow reforming telecom policy, I'd suggest that the first question ought to be, well, what's the goal? Reform for what reason? Why? What are we trying to accomplish? And there are several possible reasons, several possible goals that have been in telecom policy for a good long time. The first one I want to mention, which one is near and dear to my heart as a former employee of a federal antitrust agency, is consumer welfare. Now that may sound so broad that it could mean darn near anything. That whatever I think is good for consumers must be it. But it's actually a term of art in economics that means the situation where every unit of every resource in society is used in such a way that consumers get the most possible value out of it. So it's kind of doing the most with the resources we have to advance the interests of consumers, however it is consumers themselves define them. And 9 out of 10 times when you hear economists making policy recommendations, stepping from an analysis of how things work to, well, here's what somebody should do, implicitly they're saying, if you want to promote consumer welfare, here's what you should do. But economists aren't always careful about pointing out that they are basing their recommendation on trying to promote consumer welfare, so I figure I ought to be upfront about it. There are also other goals that telecommunications policy has historically tried to promote. And let me give you just several of the other goals that are actually somewhat respectable and probably deserve to be in the debate. There's a lot of other things that regulation sometimes promotes that we don't really want to promote, but these things are some things that have been part of the telecom debate for a long time that a lot of people would nod their heads and say, yeah, that's kind of part of the public interest, and we want to somehow be conscious of this as we're thinking about reforming telecom regulation. One of them is the issue of affordability, the idea that, separate from just sort of maximizing overall consumer welfare, we want to try to make sure that every consumer has access to service that meets some sort of definition of affordability, regardless of their income or regardless of where they live. So if somebody's income is really low, you still want them to be able to have telephone service. If somebody lives in a very rural area where it's very costly to run telephone lines, you still want them to be able to have telephone service, paying some price that we believe to be satisfy some sort of definition of affordability. Public safety is another thing that's in some cases intertwined with telecom regulation. And here is the idea that the network needs to support certain kind of services or capabilities even if it's things that customers, if they were choosing in a competitive market, might not choose to pay for. Simple example. I have E911 on my cell phone. Why do I have E911 on my cell phone? Not because I went shopping and decided I wanted to get it from a company that offered it, but because the FCC says the cell phone companies have to give it to me, whether I want it or not. I don't know for sure if I need it on my cell phone. I've also got it on my home phone. That might be good enough. But the bottom line is a policy judgment has been made that 911 is important enough that everybody who uses any kind of telecom technology ought to have access, ought to have that as part of their bundle of services that they get from their telecom company, whether the consumer would choose to buy that or not. Originally, it was landline. A few years ago, it was adopted for wireless, and of course now the FCC has moved to require VoIP providers to provide some kind of 911 service as well, at least to the best of their ability. And finally, of course, there are issues of tax revenue. Historically, telecommunications has been taxed. Why? By and large, because to raise revenue. To raise revenue. So those are at least 4 goals of telecom policy that have been part of the debate for a long time that folks may want to consider. As I said, consumer welfare is near and dear to my heart. Why do I think that's such a great thing that it definitely ought to be on the list, and probably I think ought to be the primary goal, even if it's not the only goal. And so that if we pursue other goals in telecom policy as well, we always at least want to be conscious we understand the effect on consumer welfare and know the trade-offs we're making. Why the heck is this so good? Why is this so important? Well, for one thing, traditionally, economic regulation in telecommunications was intended to try to substitute for competition. Telecom was a monopoly. We didn't have competition. It was believed to be a natural monopoly. And so, if you look at, texts on economic regulation, one of the, primary principles is you should regulate in such a way that you simulate the effects of competition in situations where you can't have competition because you're trying to control a monopoly. And if you take consumer welfare as the primary criterion guiding policy in telecom, then essentially you're treating telecom the way competition policy treats all these other industries that aren't monopolized, because consumer welfare is the guiding principle underlying antitrust policy. Another good thing about consumer welfare, you can kind of understand intuitively from my description that it's good for consumers. Consumers basically get the most for the least when policy is guided by considerations of consumer welfare. Prices tend to reflect costs when consumer welfare is the guide, and so in some sense, services don't get offered unless consumers are willing to pay for them, which means services pass some kind of a cost-benefit test, which is kind of a nice result that a lot of folks like. The other interesting thing about using consumer welfare as a guide to regulatory policy is that when consumers are in the driver's seat, that's when the innovation that you get and the jobs that are created are actually sustainable over the long term, because the people doing that innovation and creating those jobs and in those jobs are providing something that consumers have demonstrated they are willing to pay for. Why does this matter? Well, part of the reason it matters, of course, is we're in a recession now and people are concerned about job creation. The other reason it matters is, well before this recession, the telecom industry went through its own little boom and bust cycle generated by changing federal policies, where a whole lot of innovation and jobs were created in one segment of the industry called the competitive local exchange carriers, which then disappeared, at least a lot of them disappeared, as soon as federal policy on resale of the incumbents' local lines changed, or technically not resale, but the whole unbundled network element debate, which if you don't know what that is, you're lucky. If you do know what it is, I don't have to say any more, but it generated its own boom and bust cycle where we got a lot of job creation and innovation, but it was not sustainable over the long term because it depended solely on policy.